What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. May is over, which means it's time to rank every movie that I saw this month from worst to best. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your ranking of the movies you saw in May are. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content on a near daily basis. Now, we have 28 movies to discuss this month, about the average of what I've been covering. As usual, there are a few movies from the month that I just did not get to watch yet, like Top Gun Maverick, Emergency, and RRR, and there are a few of these that I have reviews for already, but I just have not gotten a post yet, which I'll fix, but I've just been busy, so I apologize there, though all in due time. But let's not waste any more time. I don't want to be here all day. We have a lot to discuss, so let's just jump right into it. In last place is Marmaduke, the second adaptation of the popular comic strip, which sees Pete Davidson voice the title character in easily one of the year's most bizarre casting choices. But it's not one that really adds anything special, as it's essentially just Pete Davidson doing his normal shtick, except now he's Marmaduke. Despite being a comedy, the film lacks any sense of cleverness, and it goes for so many stretches without jokes at times that I can't even see the target audience of kids enjoying this. On top of that, the animation is truly ugly, and it contains way too many moments of awkward pauses between sentences and disjointed character moments, which gives the film a somewhat surreal feel. This was a painfully dull and unfunny experience, and if you have kids, I recommend showing them something else. Next up is The Twin, a creepy kid horror movie from Shudder that plays into familiar beats we've seen from films like The Omen or Pet Sematary, except if those were totally void of emotion or death. While Teresa Palmer as this grieving mother does try her best here, the film often repeats story beats and tropes that we've seen in countless other horror movies, all while wallowing in self-seriousness, so that it never makes for either a fun or gripping time. On top of that, the film takes a hard left turn in its final few minutes with a ridiculous twist ending that simply does not gel with the rest of the story, venturing into so bad it's good territory and leaving things off with a disjointed, clunky mess. Then we have Gold, which sees Zac Efron stuck in one location trying to protect a valuable gold nugget, while also making sure he doesn't get eaten by wild dogs in the area. I often have a soft spot for films that try to do a lot narratively with so little, but unfortunately this isn't an instance where it pulls it off. While Zac Efron gives a very committed performance and he elevates some of the material, it rarely felt like the film actually explored the psychological aspects to his character, so my investment only went so far. And the tension stemming from this one location setup, all the moments of escalation often felt repetitive in nature, so it felt like the film was constantly spinning its wheels and it really wasn't developed past its initial setup. It's commendable and it's well made, but unfortunately, as a whole, it just didn't work for me. Number 25. Blacklight, yet another in a long line of Liam Neeson action thrillers. It's very been there, done that, and your enjoyment of this will primarily be based around how much you like or dislike these movies to begin with. For me, it can be some mindless fun at times, but there are several very odd decisions made by the characters, and there's also a lot of clunky on-the-nose dialogue that just did not work, especially as it tries half-heartedly to add this political thriller edge to it. It's definitely not the worst thing out there, despite being the lowest rated of all these Liam Neeson action thrillers, but it's also nothing to write home about either. Next up is Ahed's Knee, an art house drama that focuses on a filmmaker who attempts to take an introspective look at his career and personal struggles, all while trying to fight back against this system that stifles creative freedoms. While it has a strong message that injects a pseudo-political thriller into an otherwise somber character drama, I just felt it rang a little emotionally hollow due to this filmmaker character being extremely arrogant and self-serving anytime we try getting to know him, because he only ever seems to truly engage with anyone when they fawn over his work, and his general demeanor otherwise was pretty emotionally disconnected. So while I appreciated the themes, I just never found him to be all that likable, and it gave this an air of pretentiousness at times. The film might have its audience for those in art house circles who do appreciate themes more than anything else, but I needed a little more here. Bringing us into the okay list of films is Sneakerella, the modern update of Cinderella set in the world of sneakers and graphic design. While it makes some tweaks to the characters and gives things an extra layer of nuance, it still follows more or less the exact same beats as the original story, and as a result, it's pretty predictable. And at times, it felt relatively low stakes, but there's a charm to it, and it's amusing enough that kids, who are very clearly the target audience, will get a kick out of it. It's not pandering though, and as a result, I do think it's fun enough that the whole family might get some enjoyment out of it. But I still wouldn't say it exactly added a whole lot for anyone if you're out of that target audience beyond the one-time watch. But still, for what it is, it's fun enough. Then we have Gajarin, a very small-scale film about a group of teenagers to try fixing their hometown from being demolished. The film has a very nostalgic feel to it due to its old-fashioned story of townspeople coming together to save their town from being destroyed, and it also has these daydream sequences of our title character dreaming of being an astronaut. And in these moments, it feels very whimsical, but at the same time, it also won't sugarcoat things when it comes to its more grounded elements, giving it a heavier feel. So it does lead a little bit to a tonal imbalance at times, and I felt it didn't have quite as deep of an emotional impact as it should have for how contained it can sometimes feel, but there's still enough charm to it, especially due to the bond shared by our three main leads, that's bound to put a smile on your face. Then we have Operation Mincemeat, a World War II drama that also mixes in elements of a political spy thriller as well as, well, Weekend at Bernie's, as strange as that is to say, and it's all based on a true story. At least most of it is. While the film has such a unique premise involved passing off a corpse as someone alive, and it was intriguing to see how it all played out, I do think there was a missed opportunity to lean in just a little more into just how out there the whole story was. And instead we get bogged down with this corny romance subplot that really didn't add much to the story, and of all things, that was the only part of the movie that was not actually based on anything true. So while it can be gripping at times, we do get bogged down with maybe a bit too much in these dry, exposition-heavy sequences that just were not all that compelling. But then again, I'm also not the biggest fan of political spy thrillers, so for those of you who are fans of this genre, this may not bother you. Still, despite my issues with it, it's not a bad movie, it's got great direction and solid performances from Colin Firth and Jason Isaacs, and it was enough to outweigh the stuff I didn't like. I just wish the writing overall matched its technical aspects. Number 20, Lingui the Sacred Bonds, the Chadian entry for Best International Feature at this year's Oscars that didn't make the shortlist, which explores the subject of abortion in a society where it's still legally and morally condemned. It's certainly a topical film that may connect deeply with some audiences, and it does handle it in a delicate manner. However, since it presents its story in such a grounded manner with its emphasis on subtlety, it just didn't always feel like the most emotional experience, and that can be a little off-putting for some people. It's still very well acted, and it's a beautiful looking film, and it was mostly a compelling watch, even if it wasn't quite as profound as I think it should have been. Next up is Off Season, a creepy, atmospheric horror that evokes a lot of Lovecraftian imagery, while also telling us a pretty engaging mystery. There's a clear love for vintage horror on display here, especially feeling like something in the vein of a schlocky B-movie, which I really appreciated, and it all goes well together with its mystery aspect. However, what ultimately holds it back for me is that the characterization winds up feeling a little thin, and it ends up not sticking the landing on any of the emotional factors it starts to explore. It's definitely well acted, but the writing for the actual characters just didn't match. I think had that been the case though, it would have been a really solid movie, but as it stands, it's still some decent B-movie fun. Next up is Windfall, a Hitchcockian thriller about a robbery that goes on for way much longer than the three people involved ever expected it to. This one's a decent enough time overall. I will say, if nothing else, the performances by Jason Segel, Lily Collins, and especially Jesse Plemons are all great, and they're a big part of why this works. And I did like the accompanying score, which did help raise the stakes, and it made this feel like the sort of film Hitchcock himself would have directed if he were alive today. But where this stumbles for me is when it comes to its motivations and characterizations. We only learn so much about each character, and even when we do, it's all just explained to us. And because of that, we'll have several moments later on in the film that are meant to have a greater emotional impact, and they just did not quite get there for me. And because I was only left feeling so much emotionally, it made this feel like an acting exercise more than anything. Still enough to check the movie out, but I just don't know if I necessarily rewatch it anytime soon. Then we have You Are Not My Mother, a character drama that also mixes in mystery and folk horror elements to mostly success. It centers around a young girl's mother going missing, only for her to come back changed, leading her to figuring out what's going on with her. The direction this movie's headed is pretty obvious right from the get-go, and it also has a dour tone you have to be in the right mood for. However, it does place a clear emphasis on our character's emotional state as we go further down this journey. So it contains the look of all these low-budget, moody, slow-burning horror movies, but it didn't feel like quite a slog to get through. I think it makes for a mostly solid watch, but it's definitely one that'll leave you pretty depressed by the end of it. So make sure you're up for something like this before checking it out. Next up, Marvelous in the Black Hole, a sweet, whimsical coming-of-age movie about finding your niche and forming bonds in the most unexpected places. It's not exactly a laugh-out-loud romp, and it never quite reaches the emotional impact as it was hoping to achieve, as it only goes so deep, but it's still a film that wears its heart on its sleeve and will be sure to put a smile on your face, especially due to a standout performance by Rhea Perlman in particular. It ultimately looks to explore complex topics such as grief, though I think what ultimately holds it back is its incredibly short runtime of 80 minutes. I think had it added even 10 more minutes to the runtime, it would have elevated things exponentially, but for what it was, it's still cute. At number 15 is Men, the third film by Alex Garland that sees him move away from sci-fi and venture into folk horror territory with an eerie exploration of toxic masculinity. The film is very symbolic in nature, though it still offers a fairly compelling character study with a great lead performance by Jessie Buckley that blends together intriguing themes and an engaging narrative about processing grief. And for the most part, I thought Garland's storytelling was effective, though where it ultimately lost me was its final act, which just felt like a surrealist nightmare disconnected from reality, but didn't add anything further to the story or expand any more on the themes Garland was exploring for the first two-thirds. And while this last act is still entertaining and visually striking, it still causes to be a bit of a frustrating watch for me. It definitely opens itself up to multiple viewings where you can try picking up on what you missed on the first go-around, and at some point I would like to do that, but as it stands, this was my least favorite of Alex Garland's movies, and it's the one where I'd say exercise caution when proceeding. Bringing us into the good tier is Anais in Love, a whimsical, romantic comedy in the vein of The Worst Person in the World, that focuses on this narcissistic, out-of-touch lead character who eventually has to learn the hard way about gaining perspective and seeing things from others' points of view. It's a film that's both very funny and thematically rich, and each of these characters are ones you can totally believe are real people, and because of that, you might just understandably become absorbed in what their next move is. For me, while I didn't flat out love the film for just how out of touch this character can be, I understood what it was going for, and I thought Anais de Moustier gave a great performance as the title character, and I still found it very funny, so I would recommend it. Next up is Huda's Salon, a gripping little war drama that's ultimately an examination of things like fighting back against patriarchal societies, the betrayal of tight-knit communities, and who the true enemies are in the face of war, with these two parallel storylines showcasing how two different women react when being placed in these tough situations against their will. I don't think the film reaches quite as emotionally profound of a level as it was looking to explore with some of these themes, as it does feel pretty contained for the most part, but this was a lot more engaging than I thought it would be, especially in the way it uses dialogue to craft so much simmering tension, so it kept me on the edge of my seat quite a number of times. Then we have The Curse, a werewolf movie set in 19th century France that doesn't operate completely like your typical werewolf movie. Rather than it just being non-stop encounters with the wolf right out of the gate, this is more of a character drama centered on the townspeople, with the wolf being a lingering presence all throughout the film, though one that's strong enough you still clearly feel. Boyd Holbrook drives much of the film forward as this Van Helsing type character who makes it his mission to hunt the wolf down, and he is quite captivating, as is Kelly Riley as the wife of this land baron. And the film can be often unsettling due to some impressive camera work by Sean Ellis, who not only wrote and directed the film, but handled the cinematography as well. It's kind of a shame that its theatrical release went so quietly, as it's one of those mainstream movies that they really don't make all that often anymore. Then we have Crush, a teen romantic comedy starring Disney alums Roland Blanchard and Alihi Carvalho that involves a messy love triangle, mistaken identities, and a little bit of a detective story thrown in there. Now, this doesn't exactly come together into something quite as fresh as I'm making this sound, as it does follow a lot of familiar beats in the teen rom-com genre. You can kind of guess where the movie winds up going pretty quickly, but there's still a lot of sincerity in the way it's all presented, thanks to its snappy banter and its charming chemistry between Blanchard and Carvalho. It's a lighthearted ride in the vein of a John Hughes movie, and if you're looking for an easy watch, then this might be the movie for you. Bringing us into the top 10 is All My Friends Hate Me, in which a group of college friends spend a weekend away together, and one of them suspects the others are all turning on him. The film is marketed as a horror comedy, but it's more of a dark comedy centered on social anxieties, with the seemingly mundane interactions being presented with a horror aesthetic. So it's not a film where there's an actual sense of danger for our main character. However, despite it not being the movie it necessarily marketed itself as, it's still a fun time, especially for the way it uses genre elements to explore relatable topics like how we want others to perceive us. It can sometimes be a bit too dry in its execution, but its blending of comedic and horror elements were fun enough overall to make this worth the watch. Number 9, The Sadness, which has gained quite the reputation as one of the most violent, disturbing zombie movies out there, and rightfully so, as this contains so many sequences spread all throughout the film that are nothing but sheer brutality. And your enjoyment of this is primarily going to come down to how much you like these gory sort of movies and what your definition is of crossing the line. For me, because the movie plays each of its violent moments up in a hyper-stylized and over-the-top manner where it's not looking to necessarily just make you feel depressed by watching it, I was on board with it, as I'm always down for mindless, over-the-top action or horror movies. Now, the violence aside, that is where my criticisms of the film actually do come into play, as its story and characterizations are pretty thin, and there's no real arc for any of these characters, nor does it feel like it ultimately has anything to say outside of containing some parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic that ultimately said a lot of stuff we already know. And because of that, my emotional investment only went so far, so while I liked the film overall, I still didn't quite love it. Number 8, Duel, the latest film from Riley Stearns, which mixes a bleak existential world presented in a minimalist style, though mixed with an awkward, deadpan sense of humor. It's a mix of styles that I can see not being for everyone, especially as the jokes can be so dry you might find yourself having to go back and hear them again, but I'm a fan of Stearns' approach, especially in the way he captures some of the odd intricacies and hang-ups we all tend to have. But at the center of this is Karen Gillan, in 2 separate performances as a woman and her clone, who eventually have to duel to the death, since only one of them can stay alive. And while I thought there was room to expand upon her characters a bit, I thought she did a great job in both roles, fitting nicely into Stearns' dry sense of humor, as did Aaron Paul as her equally awkward instructor. The muted feel of this world and its types of jokes are definitely more of an acquired taste, but I thought it was done well enough overall, and it makes this another solid effort from Riley Stearns, who's a director I'm going to keep looking forward to. Number 7, The Innocents, a brutal subversion of the superhero origin story that takes a Lord of the Flies approach at the corruption of innocents and what happens when those who aren't responsible enough wield great powers. It's a pretty bleak and uncomfortable watch, especially in its shocking moments of violence among these conflicts with little kids, but it also doesn't look to make you feel that way for the sake of it, as its thematic explorations do get us to an emotional core. It's definitely not going to be for everyone, and my one major hang-up with it is that it doesn't quite do the best job explaining some of the powers, but this was a solid watch, and it's one that's rewarding if you can get through movies like this. Bringing us into the great category at number 6 is Hatching, which combines elements of a psychological thriller and an old-fashioned creature feature, which results in some B-movie fun while also being a compelling character study, and it's surprisingly effective at balancing both out, with a few darkly comedic moments of our lead trying to cover up this bird monster's existence to her family, while also dealing with the mounting pressure she feels to do what her demanding mother wants. It's not the sort of movie that's going to explain how something like this is all necessarily possible, especially one element that gets introduced a little later on, and I think it could have even played things up as a dark comedy just a touch more, but still, it makes for a captivating watch and an overall solid horror movie. Number 5, On the Count of Three, the directorial debut of Jerrod Carmichael, which is a dark comedy on the topic of suicide, which is admittedly some really tricky territory right off the bat. But if you're somehow concerned this is going to be in poor taste, then fear not, as this actually goes about it in a very delicate way, with the humor stemming more from the sharp banter between our 2 leads, played by Carmichael himself and Christopher Abbott. The film balances its darkly humorous moments with a sentimental tone about the realizations we come to when we think the chips are down, and while I don't think it always handled those tonal shifts the smoothest, it's still mostly an effective tragicomedy that has me looking forward to more from Carmichael behind the camera. Number 4, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, starring Nicolas Cage as essentially a walking parody of himself as he gets caught between being this fan's friend as well as being a secret agent. The film is essentially the internet's view of what we think of when it comes to Nicolas Cage, and it would venture into some cartoon territory quite a number of times, but in all the best ways possible. But while Cage himself is great, Pedro Pascal also shines, having just as many memorable moments that were nothing short of brilliant, and the chemistry between the two just makes me want to see more movies with them together. Now, the one thing holding this back a little for me is this CIA secret agent subplot, which just doesn't gel with the rest of the movie for how generic it feels, but even with that being a very noticeable weak spot, it's still a lot of fun, and it mostly lived up to my expectations. At number 3, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which not only gives us our first MCU horror movie, but it also gives us the first Sam Raimi film in nearly a decade. And this was such a fun return to the big screen for the legendary horror director, who brings in all his usual camera tricks, goofy sense of humor, and macabre imagery to make this an absolute blast. And this feels very much like an actual Sam Raimi movie, just as much as it is an MCU movie. Now, there are times where those styles might occasionally conflict, but there's no mistaking who's the director here. Now, it's also worth noting that if Raimi wasn't directing this, this might not have worked quite as well as this ultimately did. Because while the film did benefit from its 2-hour runtime and its breezy pacing, it still felt rushed here and there, with some clunky dialogue that would have brought the movie down considerably had Raimi's flair, along with Danny Elfman's score, not intensified things. That being said, there were still some compelling character arcs for both Doctor Strange as well as Wanda Maximoff, with both Benedict Cumberbatch and Elizabeth Olsen giving great performances. There was a lot of fun horror imagery, a lot of great laughs, and I hope the MCU takes more risks like this moving forward. At number 2 is Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, which is essentially the modern day Who Framed Roger Rabbit, with the way it pokes fun at the animation medium as a whole. And if you love this medium, you're going to have an absolute blast with it. While its story does leave a little to be desired, its ultimate appeal lies in its charm and its sharp sense of humor. While this still adheres somewhat to the Disney brand, the Lonely Island sense of humor is clearly felt all throughout this, and it feels just as much as their movie as it is Disney's, and it results in a lot of solid meta gags and fun one-liners, with John Mulaney and Andy Samberg being absolutely fantastic as the title characters. I had a great time with it, and it's easily one of the best Disney Plus original movies. But in first place, easily, is the Bob's Burgers movie, which essentially does feel like just an extended, grander episode of the TV show, and it's one which your enjoyment of will mostly be based off how you feel about the show, but that's also exactly part of its charm and why I just had an absolute blast with it. It's an hour and 40 minutes of the Belchers getting into all their usual hijinks, with rapid-fire throwaway jokes galore, but with some extra musical numbers and a murder mystery thrown in there. And while it doesn't reach the profound levels of emotion you get in, say, a Pixar movie, it still has plenty of heart and charm to go along with it that will be sure to delight. It's got plenty of laughs, plenty of heart, it's a good time with some of my favorite TV characters, it gave me everything I wanted from it, and it comes in as my number 1 movie in May. But let me know, which movies did you like the most in May? Was it anything I listed here? Was it something I left off? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.